Well, hello everyone. This is Martin Lush, President of NSF Health Sciences, the Pharmaceutical Biotech Division. Welcome again to a continuation of our free webinar program. This one is on something that I think all of us have a vested interest in, which is namely how to make decisions, not just routine decisions, but in particular decisions when we're under an awful lot of pressure. And looking down the list of participants, we have VPs, we have lots of qualified persons, we have people in charge of manufacturing and operations, global leads, and so on and so forth. And I think the theme that links us all together is the realization that a lot of the decisions that we each make every day are often compromised potentially by being under a huge amount of pressure. So this is our June offering of that webinar program. So welcome once again, because many of you have listened to many of the ones that came before. Usual points to note, this is short and sharp, 30 minutes long, recorded and available for circulation and sharing afterwards. And I would really encourage you to do this, because the more that people understand and know about this subject, the easier their life will be, the better their decisions will be as a result. Any questions you ask, ladies and gentlemen, please email them to me separately. I'll deal with them later, but I always do get back to people that ask questions. Please feedback. We always want to improve these webinars in any way we can, and we can only do that with your feedback, together with any recommendations for improvement. And, I try and post as many useful articles on LinkedIn as I can, whether it be around quality culture, human error, decision making, most recent one on KPI. So please, I'd encourage you to follow me on LinkedIn for free resources as well. Most of you already know who I am. One thing I'd say I am always trying to be is a better decision maker, because like us all, I'm still practicing that art, whether it be in my role leading NSF Health Sciences, Pharma, Biotech, whether it was when I was a qualified person, whether it was in charge of manufacturing operations or auditing, or indeed at home as a husband and father. One area I'm always looking to improve is decision making, because we become what our decisions make us. So decisions that we each make have a profound effect on whether it be our professional lives or our personal lives. I'll start with a story, ladies and gentlemen, just to frame this. When before I got married and was told I had to be responsible, one of my hobbies was mountaineering. This was a picture taken on a particular climb somewhere in Europe, if I remember rightly. A friend and I were involved in this climb, and we were pretty experienced mountaineers. We came across another couple of Brits, younger than us in fact, and we sort of followed or leapfrogged our way up this particularly challenging climb. We were climbing for about 9 or 10 hours, pretty exhausted at this stage. And there's a rule in alpine mountaineering, if there are any mountaineers listening to this, that if you don't get to your summit by midday, you better turn around beforehand, because risk increases when you are late. Now, during this day, we were moving very, very slowly. My friend and I stopped, and we actually went through a risk-based decision-making process. We weighed up the pros, we weighed up the cons. We decided, even though the summit was no more than 200 meters away, we made a decision to turn around. The people, the other guys that we joined up with, listened to our decision-making process, looked at us bemused when we'd said, we're turning back. They continued, and unfortunately both of them fell to their deaths. Now, as catastrophic as clearly that example is, I use it and it sticks with me, because what it said to me was, Martin, you better keep practicing, and you better keep refining, you better keep improving your decision making, because it can have a profound effect on everything that you do. And what was of fascination to me when I reflect on the experience that I've just just shared with you, is that we had 4 people sat on a ledge with the same equipment, the same skill level and competency, the same levels of, at the time, stress and chronic fatigue, exposed to the same environment and the same conditions. In other words, we were looking at the same data and information, and yet we came up with a different decision. Myself and my colleague decided to turn down. They decided to continue, even though they had listened to us in our decision-making process. What was different, which led to that change in decision, was experience. They were less experienced than us. Their team dynamics were different to team dynamics between myself and my colleague. Their risk appetite was different. They were younger and more risk-seeking. But importantly, their decision-making was very, very different. My friend and I made a fairly objective, I guess driven by our experience, decision, whereas they made a very emotional decision because they wanted to tick the summit off their checklist. They could see their end goal, and they were driven to achieve that. Ultimately, they made a different decision, and there was a rather tragic outcome as a result. Decision-making under pressure is very, very different, as I think we can all reflect on our own experiences. It's certainly very, very different to making decisions in the cool light of day. This is an episode that I think many of us will remember a few years ago when Captain Sullenberger landed an aeroplane on the Hudson River as a result of a double-engine failure, I think at 3,000 feet. And what I'm going to do, and this was an example of how to make decisions when under considerable pressure. Now, none of us are going to be in that type of situation. However, with many of the decisions that we make on a routine basis under pressure, the same internal processes apply. So my promise to you in the 20-odd minutes that remain, ladies and gentlemen, is to dispel some myths. I want to share with you decision-making, what evolution has provided us with. In other words, what goes on between our ears when we make a decision under considerable pressure. I'm going to share with you a process that we at NSF have refined over a period of 25 years. NSF, previously David Begg Associates, we've been involved in training of qualified persons in Europe for 25 years, and we school our QPs at least in how to make decisions under pressure. And I'm going to share with you the process that most of our QPs are exposed to. So this is a process that has been used and proven and refined so that it works over a period of time. I want to share with you some experiences and also ultimately really, really encourage you to practice, refine, and improve your own decision-making processes. Captain Sullenberger, this was the captain, very experienced airline pilot who had the responsibility of taking off from LaGuardia Airport. He gets to 3,000 feet, flies into a flock of geese, and has a double-engine failure. And when you listen to what he said and you read what he has written when he reflected on this experience, this is what you conclude. This was a guy who accepted reality that there was no way they were going to make it to the airport. So flight traffic control were attempting to redirect him to the nearest airport at the same time as he's trying to control this airplane without any engines. It made it very, very clear we're not going to make it. He ripped up the rule book. They had a checklist for managing a double-engine failure, but the checklist was designed to be used at a higher altitude. So he immediately recognized that the rules for dealing with this situation and making the right decision were frankly no longer fit for purpose. He was at a lower altitude, therefore he had to use all the available data that he had available. He weighed up his options, he assessed the risks, But interestingly, when you listen to the commentary that you can do when you YouTube this, he stayed very, very calm, he stayed very, very focused, he stayed very, very unemotional. So in other words, he managed to make the right decision under pressure by doing the right things. And those right things I will share with you as we go through. This is a wonderful quote from him. I knew that for 42 years I've been making regular deposits in this bank of experience, education and training. And on January the 15th, that balance was sufficient, so I knew I could take and make a very large withdrawal. So what he's really saying there is that his knowledge and his experiences through years and years of practice and improvement and refinement had enabled him to, in the space of 3 minutes, successfully complete a landing on water. Now we'll come back to the relevance of this quote later on. One myth I want to dispel, and I have a picture of Spock version number 1, who, when you followed Star Trek, Spock was the guy who was unemotional, very logical. And for many, people think that decision making is just that, a very logical process. We gather data, we objectively assess that information, weigh up the pros and cons, we make a decision, and we do it at very, very fast speed. And when you get and read books on decision making, when you go on courses on decision making, they all push this myth that this is all decision making is about. Keep it logical, gather the data, weigh up the pros and cons, objectively assess the risks, make a decision, and it is as simple as that. Unfortunately, it's not. And for many of us who have been in pressurized situations, nothing like landing an aeroplane full of people on a river, nothing like that, but decisions under pressure at work are actually compromised by a lot of things that go on between our ears. And the problems, evolution has given us some really, really valuable tools and techniques in the decisions that we make. But in the modern day world, often what we have, those tools and techniques, are actually no longer fit for purpose. So typically decisions made under pressure are impacted by cognitive overload. In other words, too much data, too many distractions will lead to a very, very poor decision. The power of habit, making decisions based upon what we have done before, even though the situation we face now may well, in fact, be very different. Importantly, the impact of stress, the impact of fatigue, the impact of emotion can be profound on our decision-making process, and we will come back to this later. We're impacted by our own bias. We're impacted by groupthink, that is, the actions and words and decisions of those around us. We're all very social creatures, and it takes tremendous courage to speak out in a group when everybody else seems particularly happy with the decision that they collectively have made. We're impacted by distraction, we're impacted by levels of hydration, we're impacted by what we're doing at the time, we're impacted by what we eat, we're impacted by our levels of fatigue, often as a result, if you're working shift patterns, of lack of sleep. So it's not as clear-cut as Spock would lead us to believe. And one thing that is worth emphasizing more is the impact of stress, emotion, and pressure. When we're under pressure, we automatically become more risk-averse. That's not a surprise, because why take a risk when you don't have to? When we're under pressure, we also have a tendency to ignore or shut out vital information. You don't even see it. When we're under pressure, it also encourages us to drive towards consensus, in other words, groupthink, with the individuals that we're with at the time. It also causes us to oversimplify a situation. Pressure also leads to erosion of short-term memory, and it often causes us to forget the big picture or the context within which that decision is framed. So this notion that come what may, we logically analyze data, we weigh up the pros and cons, and Spock-like come to a decision that is clear-cut is frankly wrong. Because from an evolutionary perspective, we're actually affected in our decision-making by all of those factors we've just considered, but importantly, the stress, the emotion, and the pressure of the time. What goes on between our ears is really nicely summarized. If you haven't read this book, it's really worth getting. It's written by Steve Peters. He's a medic, he's a psychiatrist, specialized in what goes on between our ears, particularly under conditions of high pressure and high stress. And he really came to the public attention as a result of the success the UK Team GB had in the last Olympics. Team GB were really, really good at sports that required sitting down. So cycling, rowing, we're pretty good at. Some of that success has been attributed to Steve and his mind management tools and techniques, because what he managed to do is to coach athletes in how to deal with pressure and stress and to make decisions that were right at that time. Now, Steve describes the brain. The brain is hugely complicated, and what he's actually done is to simplify it considerably. So what Steve says is, look, there are many, many parts of the brain. You have the frontal lobe, what he calls the human brain. You have the parietal part of the brain, which he calls the computer brain. And he has what he calls the chimp brain, which is located in the limbic system. Now, each of these has a particular function, and we need to understand this in order to understand how we manage decisions under considerable pressure. Roles and responsibilities, each of those three parts of the brain that Steve refers to has a particular function. So take, for example, the chimp brain. This is the chimp brain that is part of the limbic system. This is really, really important for us because it is there to protect us. This is a part of our brain that governs our fight, flight, or freeze response, as well as reproduction. So the objective of the chimp brain is to safeguard the species. It's to look after us. The human brain, which is the bit at the front, the frontal lobes, this is the part of the brain that Spock believes we use all of the time. It's there for logical analysis and problem solving. Whereas the computer brain, the parietal part of the brain, that is where our knowledge and our experience and our memories are stored that can have a profound effect on our decisions. So, when an event happens, we can interpret it one of two ways. We can interpret it through the position of the chimp, which is there to protect us. So that chimp part of our brain considers the feelings, the impressions. It drives our emotional thinking, and those emotions drive a certain course of action. Whereas our human brain looks at the truth, what is presented in front of us, logically analyzes that, and then gets to a plan of action. Now, those plan of actions are very, very different depending upon which part of the brain is engaged at the time. And the challenge for each every one of us is that the most dominant part of our thinking process is the chimp, which is not surprising because that chimp is there to protect us. This is the part of the brain that is there to protect us. We either fight, we flight, we freeze. It is about self-preservation. And that's the way we have been wired, not surprisingly. So whenever we're presented with a decision, an input under conditions of pressure and stress, the chimp comes first. and then the human second. So that logical analysis actually doesn't take place until the chimp has said their piece. So when you're faced with a situation where you're thinking, what the hell do I do when I lose both engines at 3,000 feet? Hopefully that's not going to happen to any of us. Or when your son phones up to say he's been involved in a road accident. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Or when your HVAC system fails and you're in a plant room when the alarms are going crazy in a grade A, B, and C area. Or when an FDA inspector asks you your most feared question. Or you have a second consecutive media fill failure, or you miss your last flight home. The decision-making process that I've just described, chimp first, in other words, that emotional fight, flight, freeze response, actually kicks in initially and very powerfully above the more logical process that our brain is also capable of. So the bottom line is that if we want to make good, logical, risk-based decisions, we have to think very carefully about how we manage those emotions. In other words, manage our chimp. So when under pressure, and let's face it, those pressures are only going to get more and more as industry becomes more pressurized in a world of continuous change, one thing that is really going to be very, very important is how to manage your chimp, your emotions, so that you can engage the other powerful parts of your brain, the computer brain and your human brain, so you actually make a decision based upon all of these rather than it being dominated by just one. Now, as far as the chimp is concerned, that is the limbic system of the brain, which kicks in immediately. You cannot control this. It's there to protect you. So it's very, very powerful. It's also fueled by cortisol, released through stress. So the more stressful, the more cortisol, therefore the louder the chimp shouts. That then causes us to ignore the facts, to prevent us looking into our experiences and our knowledge. We end up making, therefore, a very emotionally driven decision. It prevents us from engaging the computer brain where we can build on our experience and our knowledge, just as Sullenberger did. He's managed his chimp, he controlled his emotions, and he used considerable, i.e. 42 years of knowledge, to land that aeroplane. It also, good chimp management, also allows us to engage with our problem-solving part, where analysis and the problem-solving process can subsequently take place. So what I call chimp management is absolutely vital. So remember, don't make what could turn out to be a permanent decision to satisfy your temporary emotion. Certainly when I reflect on good and bad decisions that I've made, the bad decisions have always been accompanied by high levels of emotion, high levels of stress, high levels of fatigue. And as soon as the emotional part, the chimp part of the brain is engaged, we end up making permanent decisions that we often regret to satisfy your feelings at the time. So how do we go about using that knowledge to make what I would call whole brain decisions rather than chimp-dominated ones that in a survival situation may be the right ones to make, but in the day-to-day decision, often the wrong ones. So I'm going to take you through a very simple four-step process. Now, it is really quite simple, but you've got to practice and refine. Firstly, let's create the space between the event, that decision-making stimuli, and your decision. Create some inner calmness, and we'll talk about that later. You then follow a simple process that you are comfortable with, and you never accept that's as good as it can be, because you constantly practice and refine, practice and refine. So, in more detail, number one, You're faced with a difficult situation. Somebody comes up to you, you're a QP, demanding immediate batch release. You look at the batch manufacturing record, you realize that there is data missing. You realize that it doesn't feel right. You realize that reconciliation or yield are outside their limits. So you don't feel comfortable making that decision. If you're ever in a situation when people are putting you under pressure, or the situation is putting you under pressure, create a space between that stimulus and the response. The shorter that space, in other words, the more immediate your decision, the more likely that is going to be an emotional decision that you will regret, because you haven't engaged all of the brain's capabilities, the human, the computer. This is purely a chimp-driven response. The bigger the gap between the stimulus and the response, the more time you can create to think about it. That's when you can seek clarification, you can get data, you can seek the counsel of others, you can think about your experiences. In other words, the bigger the gap, the greater the probability that you will manage that chimp and actually engage with other parts of the brain that will enable you to make the right decision. So, number one, create a space between the stimulus and your response, your decision. The more important that decision, the bigger the space. And we're not talking days or weeks. It's just don't make a decision under pressure that is a knee-jerk response. Number two is actually just taking a chill pill, calming a little bit, doing a bit of a reality check. Because often conditions under stressful situations are not as stressful as you immediately think they are when you take a step back and actually ask these types of questions. You know what? Is this going to kill me? Probably not. Is this going to even harm me? Really? I doubt it. What's the real probability of this thing going really badly wrong? Can I do anything about it? Because if I can't do anything about it, why should I worry about it? Certainly one technique I've used is diaphragmatic breathing. Anything that slows the breathing down enables you to be more relaxed. Creating the space in itself is a powerful tool and technique. But the focus is on slowing things down at this stage. In other words, controlling levels of stress, controlling levels of cortisol, saying to your chimp, hey, I've got this in control here. You don't need to be worried about my safety. I need to just look at the data. I need to discuss it with a few other people. I am in control. So slowing things down. And then number three is to follow a simple process. Now this process, when you look at it, you think, boy, that's kind of complex. It's not, and I'll explain as we go through. A situation presents itself that requires a decision. Now, the chimp would be saying, do something. Do it now. Do it quickly. Whole brain thinking is actually to say, okay, I need to investigate. I need to get data. I need to talk to people. I need to reduce my uncertainty that I face with this situation. Once you've done that, you have a more accurate diagnosis. You know what faces you rather than immediately reacting. You've done the investigation. Look, we're not talking days or weeks. We're talking sometimes hours just by asking very, very carefully crafted questions of the right people. The what, the why, the when, the who, the where, the what if. Very broad levels of questions that allow you to more fully understand the situation, having driven down the uncertainty, that allows you then to do the risk assessment. What could go wrong? What do I need to consider? How do I control those risks? How do I reduce severity, reduce probability, increase detectability? What options do I have? Communicate, implement, and then follow up. Now, it's not as linear as this proposes. Nothing is ever that simple. What I'm trying to say is when you make a decision under pressure, just follow a process. It may not be perfect, but it gives you a disciplined approach that enables you to manage that chimp, engage the other parts of the brain that leads you to a more logical conclusion. But there is one spoiler alert here, ladies and gentlemen, which is this process, and any decision-making process is never perfect, and it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So don't go for perfection, go for what works most of the time. And that process that I showed earlier is the one that we school our QPs in when they attend our course. They practice that process through use of many, many case studies. They refine it. They become more comfortable with it. And the practice is really, really important, ladies and gentlemen, because to overcome the power of that chimp, to overcome the emotions that stressful decision-making drive, you've got to be comfortable with it. Going back to Steve Peters, the best athletes in the world are not necessarily the most physically developed. They are all capable, through practice, of controlling their emotions when in the competitive arena, when the emotion and stress are considerably high. Practice through case studies, through practicing scenarios under simulated conditions, reflecting on real-life examples, learning from others who make good decisions under practice, under real-life conditions. And also, when you make a decision that is poor, don't accept it, forensically examine the reasons why. And just some last points, ladies and gentlemen, in the closing few minutes. And this is just very personal from me to you, based on my own experiences. The bigger the gap between stimulus and response, the better your decision. Use the process that I've described, or a process that you design, remember to keep it simple, to proportionate to the risk that you face and the importance. When you consider risk, and that's a big driver in our decision-making process, always focus on probability of that risk really occurring. So many people use a high, medium, and low. That's not particularly precise. And the ability to really objectively weigh up probability of something going wrong is really, really key. Because most of the time, we overestimate something going wrong. It's that chimp trying to protect us. Always, always consider what I call the unintended consequences. When you make a decision, think beyond that immediate output. Think about the impact your decision, what I call the ripple effect, will have on others. Now, Sullenberger was fortunate. A lot of what he did was gut feel. His 42 years of experience enabled him to very calmly rewrite the rule book. If you have that type of experience, that can be of benefit. But if you don't, gut feel isn't always the right thing to do. Don't surround yourself ever, please, with yes people, people that just agree with you. You actually want to seek out and consult widely, and certainly for important decisions, seek out people who disagree with you. Don't defend your positions, explore the differences, because it's only through that exploration do you understand those differences, and you collectively come through with a better decision. And in any decision-making process, focus not necessarily on the output, ladies and gentlemen, but on driving down uncertainty. Figure out the situation first, the data, the facts, the safe assumptions, the opinions, and then come to your decision. So many people jump from the event, the demand for a decision, to the decision, very short space between stimulus and gap, without really focusing on the information, the data. In other words, they make a decision with a very, very high level of uncertainty, and most of the time it's wrong. Visualize the data. So often decision-making is accompanied by lots and lots of data. That leads to cognitive overload, that leads to confusion, and that leads to the chimp screaming at you just to get on with it or else. So by visualizing the data, Ishikawa diagrams, fishbone diagrams, anything that takes that burden off the brain has to be a help. Sleep on it. Sleep is an incredible decision-making tool because you see things in the morning completely different to how you see them last thing at night when you're tired, dehydrated, fatigued. Really important decision. Sleep on it, and you often come up with a different conclusion in the morning. Also, in decision making, help others with chimp management. So many of us work with colleagues who don't understand chimp management, so you get a very emotional response from them in that decision-making process. And that's where we all have a duty to help others manage their chimp so they don't make permanent decisions upon the temporary need for satisfying the chimp. And importantly, please learn from your mistakes. So just remember, keep calm, manage the chimp. When you manage the chimp, you allow that whole brain thinking by simply following that 4-step process that we described earlier. So, ladies and gentlemen, this short session, I hope I've given you more options than just the time and tested decision-making system of heads you win, tails you lose. So that's it for the summer break. Look forward to meeting you again, 26th of September, where I'm going to be talking about how do you survive in this very challenging world that we live in, what sort of tools and techniques can we apply to the day-to-day work that we're each faced with. In between, many of us will be having, myself included, vacations. So have a great vacation for all of those that are heading to sunnier climes. And lastly, and most importantly, thank you all for listening and supporting our webinar programs. They're all designed, ladies and gentlemen, to provide value and to make your lives a little bit easier. And again, if you do have any questions, please just email me. I respond to all of them. Please keep in touch. Follow me on LinkedIn, where we talk more about this. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for participating, and see you again in September. Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.